Marshall International Center at Tadana Manor, Leesburg, Virginia. Additional support was provided.
The rehabilitation of the economic structure of Europe, quite evidently, will require a much longer time and greater effort than had been foreseen.
The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance.
Some called it an intrusion into the affairs of Europe. Some called it the last best hope to unify the whole of Europe in peace. But those who fought for it and those who fought against it called it simply the Marshall Plan. It was the summer of 1945. World War II was over, and the mood on both sides of the Atlantic was euphoric. Americans tossed away their ration books and eagerly entered what Winston Churchill called the Golden Age of Glory. But for most European nations, the Golden Age would not come so easily. More than 20 million acres of Dutch farmland lay underwater. More than a third of European industry had been destroyed. 60 million people were out of work, and 100 million went hungry.
We have...
2 years went by, and the situation got worse. The summer drought of '46 cut food production even more, and the winter of '47 brought to Northern Europe the worst blizzard and coldest temperatures in memory. In 1947, President Truman appointed retired General George C. Marshall to be Secretary of State.
I would say that the biggest impression that George Marshall gave was of unselfishness and personal integrity.
Marshall's aide and interpreter, Vernon Walters, remembers him well.
He was one of the truly noble men, and I use that word advisedly, that I have known.
Marshall found his first crisis waiting, the spread of communism into Western Europe. Hunger and unemployment provided the breeding grounds for unrest in Italy, France, and in Greece, where communist-backed guerrillas were fighting to topple the government. Marshall warned President Truman that without American help, Greece would fall to the communists within weeks. The rest of Europe could be next. Marshall flew to Moscow to confront the Soviets over their intentions in Europe. In particular, the Allies' most divisive issue, the German question. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, the idea of unifying and assisting Germany was unthinkable. He liked it the way it was, impoverished, occupied by its conquerors, and divided into Soviet, French, British, and American zones.
In terms of...
2 months old, an agreement nowhere in sight, Marshall appealed for a private meeting with Stalin. Stalin kept Marshall waiting for hours before admitting him.
Marshall expressed these concerns and discussed these concerns that Western Europe was continuing to deteriorate and the conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and something had to be done.
Stalin said that you shouldn't be worried that we haven't reached any agreement. We're like two fighters that would keep on arguing and then we exhaust ourselves and we reach some kind of agreement.
General Marshall thought about what's...
Back in Washington, a grim, determined Marshall reported to the President and the American people.
We cannot ignore the factor of time involved here. The recovery of Europe has been far slower than had been expected.
Disintegrating forces are becoming evident. The patient is sinking, while the doctors deliberate.
The next day, Marshall... June 5th, 1947. Marshall was scheduled to receive an honorary degree from Harvard. He wrote the college that he would appreciate the opportunity to make a few remarks.
It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. It would be neither fitting...
The American press dutifully reported the speech, but in Washington, excitement. It was late evening when British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin heard the news. Bevin said later, "We grabbed the lifeline with both hands." In December, Marshall and his team brought the proposed legislation to Congress, where it faced an uncertain reception.
There was a long...
But the plan's most potent weapon was Marshall himself. The man whom President Truman called the greatest living American hit the road to promote the plan to businessmen, farmers, and labor unions.
The loss of European investments abroad make necessary an increase in production, far above pre-war levels. Assistance to Europe will, to a considerable extent, take the form of commodities. There is convincing evidence that the peoples of Western Europe want to preserve their free society and the heritage we share with them. It is in the American tradition to help. In helping them, we will be helping ourselves, because in the larger sense, our national interests coincide with those of a free and prosperous Europe.
Marshall always believed that his greatest contribution to the Marshall Plan was not enunciating the plan, not in being Secretary of State while others ran it, but in giving the round of speeches that convinced people wavering on the edge that the Marshall Plan was in their interests, in the interests of humanity, humanitarianism.
In January 1948, Marshall began a round of testimony before Congress.
This program will cost our country billions of dollars. It will impose a burden on the American taxpayer. It will require sacrifices today in order that we may enjoy security and peace tomorrow. It should, I think, be constantly kept in mind that this great project, which would be difficult enough in normal international political climate, must be carried to success against the avowed determination of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party to oppose and sabotage it at every turn.
His persuasiveness...
Still, Congress demanded answers to hard questions. Will American business suffer from a shortage of raw materials? Can our farmers produce enough food for Europeans and Americans? Why does the United States have to assume such a burden?
The answer is simple. The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance. It is a difficult program, but there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully.
While Marshall...
French engineering skill is much in evidence at Lac, near Pau, where newly drilled wells produce more than 700 barrels of clean oil in a single day. The latest drilling machinery and equipment were bought in America with a $350,000 ECA allocation.
Norwegians live on fish. During the war, many hundreds of canning plants were destroyed. Now, Marshall Aid is bringing to new and rebuilt factories the latest types of canning machinery.
At American headquarters in Berlin, Allied representatives turn over to city officials a check for 700,000 marks. This money, to be followed by other funds, will finally enable the Berliners to begin rebuilding their battered city. Reconstruction begins.
For Joseph Stalin, German reconstruction was grim news.
And Stalin's reaction to that was trying to dissuade the Western powers from doing so by escalation of threats and by gradual tightening of the noose around West Berlin.
On June 24th, 1948, Soviet tanks and troops barricaded the highways and railroad tracks that were West Berlin's only link to Western Germany. Nothing got in, no one got out. The U.S. went on alert, and the world held its breath.
Well, when the blockade
was answered with the Berlin airlift, which wrote history in the German skies and kept an island of democracy alive in the heart of the Soviet zone.
The Berlin airlift carrying Marshall Plan supplies continued for almost a year. Finally, in May 1949, Stalin ended the blockade.
We can say that from that on, the relations between America and Germany became really friendly. There was...
By the Marshall Plan's second birthday, the economic hemorrhaging of war-wounded Europe had slowed, and there were unmistakable signs of help. In Germany, the Faber-Castell Company used Marshall Plan dollars to import cedar from the U.S. to manufacture high-quality pencils. In Austria, Marshall Plan dollars brought electric power to rural communities, increased tourism, and introduced the old and the young to new ideas.
I remember that as children, we witnessed a very rapid change from a village that had, well, there was a horse population everywhere. You know, the horses drew carriages, the horses worked on the fields, etc. And all of a sudden it changed to a tractor-oriented and non-animal, energy-oriented agriculture. And they brought these new techniques to these farms, and they changed our lives in the countryside completely.
In the Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam rose from the ashes.
The first day we...
That money was not simply sent over to Europe. Most of the funds under the Marshall Plan were actually used to finance purchases of goods and services by the European countries in the United States. So the bulk...
In 1951, after spending $12.5 billion, the Marshall Plan came to an official end. The judgment of history was just beginning.
I think it's
a psychological effect. Just the pure fact that a victorious country and the richest country of the victorious countries offered assistance to downtrodden people who had been enemies just about 2.5 years, 3 years before. That seemed to be something that nobody had really expected.
Well, there was a widespread belief in Europe, and there's still some of it, that it was really a scheme to promote American exports to Europe, which in a sense was true. But it was necessary for the Europeans to have the means of buying the American products.
Europe as a whole was obviously on the verge, on the brink of instability, and heaven knows what sort of turmoil might have resulted. And the United States obviously couldn't sit by for its own interests, political interests, and see this happen.
Now, at long last, Marshall found the years of peaceful, contented retirement with Catherine, of which he had so long dreamed. Happy years slid by in his beloved home in Leesburg, Virginia. No one had ever earned them more. George Marshall's contented retirement lasted until 1959, when he began to suffer a series of strokes that progressively disabled him. Finally, confined to Walter Reed Hospital, he became pitifully diminished.
Churchill.
General of the Army's George Catlett Marshall died on October 16, 1959.
Marshall had been in charge of FDR's funeral, John J. Persing's funeral, and he did not want a big public display of his own funeral. He demanded a simple military funeral and burial.
I think most important for us today is the example Marshall gave of selfless public service that is all too rare in American society today. Can you imagine today an individual serving as Army Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, Special Emissary to China, Secretary of Defense, refusing to run for political office, refusing even to state his partisan position, whether he was a Republican or a Democrat?
Can you whatever in my mind, that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully.
And I don't think his memory or his contributions will ever fade.